So this part of the PowerPoint is going to be looking at early radio stations and how they began and what their characteristics were as they became part of the early radio landscape. Radio stations really didn't have a formal beginning, mainly because this technology was something that was primarily considered hobbies, toys, if you will. That is that it was something that people did in their basements, primarily men and boys who were interested in this technology. And where they tended to be the most interested was in the northeastern part of the country and the upper Midwest. And it was, much like any other hobby. You get interested in it, you start buying some equipment, you start putting it together, and then you start using it. So where these toys were being put together were in garages, homes, garages, basements, attics, bedrooms, where the equipment could be stored, building an antenna outside on the roof or on the side of the house, and then you could use it at your leisure when you wanted to have some fun. Those who did this were different types of people, particularly men and boys. Those who were into technology, electrical technology. A father and a son may have an interest in engines or something like that, and maybe read about this new electrical radio signal kind of technology. Go out and buy a transmitter or build their own transmitters if they become interested that have that level of interest, and then start broadcasting out into a city or a county of some sort. There were also some engineering schools at universities and colleges around the country who saw this as a method of teaching electrical engineering. One of the first is actually here in our home state of Wisconsin. WHA down in Madison actually began in 1914 as 9XM as their call letters. They were broadcasting. It was home, and its home was in the engineering school at the University of Wisconsin, now Madison. And but during World War I, they weren't shut down completely, but the 9XM was taken over by the Department of the Navy, and then after the war, they were allowed to continue as an independent source, independent radio station, independent from the Navy, and they took the call letters WHA in 1922. And they have the distinction of being, WHA has the distinction of being the longest uninterrupted radio station in the country, because even though World War I came along and the Department of the Navy took over the station, they were still broadcasting. So they have been on the air longer than any other radio station now in the country. Another group of people who were interested in this technology were entrepreneurs. These were business people who saw this as a potential business in the future. They saw that it could be something that, with the proper investment of funds, a technology that could become very popular and could become something that they could eventually make money off of once they have invested their dollars, and it has become popular in with consumers. One of those who was one of these sort of at-home radio engineers was a man named Frank Conrad. Conrad worked for Westinghouse And he was one who was very interested in this new technology. So he basically built himself a transmitter and set himself up in his garage and started broadcasting out into the public airspace. Um, and what he would do is, what kind of entertainment, what kind of programming do you have? He would read the newspapers. He would read recipes for his wife's chocolate chip cookies or a cake or something like that, and play the gramophone for a couple of hours every other day or so. One of the things that he would do is he would ask those who were receiving the signal to send him a postcard. He gave out his address, and what he was interested in is finding out how far out into the broadcast space he was actually going. And the only way he could do that is to have people who were listening to him send him a postcard of some sort to tell them, to let him know how far he was going. He got popular enough that a local department store started stocking radios. And because people were interested in listening to him. And eventually his boss at Westinghouse found out about this and said, okay, let's try and find a way to put this into a commercial endeavor. And from this eventually came KDKA in Pittsburgh. It became established as a radio station, a commercial radio station, and its primary distinction is that it is the first radio station to broadcast election results in 1920.
It is now apparent that the Republican ticket of Harding and Coolidge is running well ahead of Cox and Roosevelt. At the present time, Harding has collected more than 16 million votes against some 9 million for the Democrats. We'll give you the state vote in just a moment. But first, we'd like to ask you to let us know if this broadcast is reaching you. Please drop us a card, address station KDKA, Westinghouse, East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
So you can hear that they were the first to broadcast the results between Harding and his opponent. And again, you heard the announcer ask people who were hearing the announcements to send them postcards because they wanted to know where their listening audience was, how far out they were going, and who was listening to them. A few years later, in 1922, another station would begin, and again with the support of one of the three corporations that are in the RCA patents pool, and that is WEAF in New York City, and started and supported by AT&T. What makes WEAF most notable is it's really one of the first to sell time with the purpose of advertising products or services. What AT&T would do is, or what WEAF would do, is allow anyone who wanted to use their facilities to create some sort of announcement, and then would actually sell time on their radio station for that announcement to go out into the audience and to promote, to sell a particular product or a service. This is what's known as toll broadcasting. That is making your facilities available to any person or group who wants to put together an announcement or put together some sort of an advertisement promoting a product or a service, and then as well selling them the time during your broadcast day when you would promote that product on your air. So this is really kind of the first vestiges of advertising, commercial advertising, that we're seeing in the early forms of radio. There is a particular problem, however. When you have somebody who wants to reach a particular audience with the product or service that they have, you as a radio station have to actually have an audience. If you are on at different times and different days, you're not going to have an audience that knows where you are, that's going to be a continuing audience. So in order to create an audience, to build an audience as a radio station, you have to be on so that people know where you are and who you are and when you're going to be on. So in order to establish an audience, you need to be on a lot. You have to be on during a specific broadcast day, every day, so that you are dependable. Your audience knows where you are, knows when you are on, and then that makes you more attractive to advertisers because they know that there is going to be an audience there to listen to their commercial at the time that they want to have their commercial on. This is what's known as sustained programming. You, as a radio station, and eventually again with television when it comes out, you will establish a broadcast day. For most radio stations and most TV stations, it runs in these early days from 6 in the morning until midnight. Sometimes, particularly for radio stations, it's dependent on when sunset is, because they may have to, because they may be on the same frequency as another radio station many miles away. They may have to go off the air at sundown, and then that leaves that frequency open to that other station. But the idea here is that you are on the air as often as possible during specific times on specific days, whether or not that programming is paid for. There may be hours during that broadcast day when you don't have any sponsored programming. You just have to put something in. But then eventually you could, as a radio station, sell that time to someone who may want to use it to promote their product or their service. And this is basically what's practiced today. Most broadcast days nowadays are, at least for TV stations, are 24 hours a day. Again, some smaller radio stations very often go off the air at sunset because they may be on the same frequency as a much bigger radio station that may be 50 or 100 or 200 miles away, because that radio station, after sundown, the signal goes much further, and so they wouldn't, by law, they can't interfere with that other station if they're on the same frequency. Eventually, in 1923, the RCA patent monopoly is dissolved. Made up of AT&T, Westinghouse, and General Electric. AT&T determines that it no longer wants to be in the radio business. Rather, it already has, it's a integral part of telephone communications throughout the country, and AT&T determines that that's where they want to put their focus, and therefore they leave RCA and concentrate primarily on telephone communication. RCA then becomes its own company, and it becomes a subsidiary of General Electric and Westinghouse. And with that comes a change in what RCA can do. Because it now is no longer a patent company, it can start to own and operate radio stations around the country, as well as start manufacturing its own equipment. So that's a look at the early radio stations. The next part of the PowerPoint that'll be available, we'll look at radio networks, because now that radio stations are becoming established, what are they going to put on for programming?